for more, we're joined from Chicago by Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez of consultants Greenmantle, and who teaches at the Kellogg Business School at Northwestern University. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thank you for having me on the show. It's always a pleasure.
Daniel, what do you do if you're the Organization of American States in the face of this latest episode with the beating of members of parliament?
Well, that's a troubling question, actually. The Organization of American States' reaction to Venezuela has been underwhelming during these recent months of crisis, largely on account not of the larger countries, the Mexicos and United States and Colombias and Brazils and Argentinas of the organization, but because of small Caribbean islands that were receptors of the Petrocaribe program, in which Venezuela gave away subsidized oil and other sort of development aid during the years of plenty. That has bought them a considerable amount of goodwill among many small countries, each of which has a vote, and which has just systematically blocked a lot of the stronger efforts towards holding Venezuela to account that OAS Secretary General Luis Almagro has been championing for most of this year.
So the MPs pressing forth, nonetheless, with their plans for this July 16th plebiscite on moves by President Nicolas Maduro to change the Constitution. Where's that going to go?
Well, it's difficult to tell. Lots of times in the past, people who focus on Venezuela have assumed that the government isn't serious with what it's going to do, whether that be nationalizing various oil projects or shutting down Radio Caracas, what was once the country's biggest television station. Often there's a assumption that the government is bluffing, which then does not pan out, and they end up doing it. That said, the political capital that it costs for Maduro to change his constitution, as seen with some of the high-level defections, most recently General Ramirez, Luis Ortega, the Attorney General, that the government has been facing. That's something that does pose a problem to Maduro, not so much because people are defecting, but because those defections are public. And that's something that is relatively new for the government. So it's possible that they will back down. They have lots of avenues for doing so, most likely through the Supreme Court, which can, as it did once before when Maduro overreached, it's able to give legitimacy and an illusion of separation of powers to what's really an about face by a government in a moment of weakness. That said, the government can play quite well off of the instability caused. Rewriting a constitution changes all of the assumptions as to how a government or how a country is going to be governed. So, for example, one possibility would be that the National Assembly's capacities or their responsibilities and powers, which right now are being routinely ignored, be sort of informally shifted to the Constituent Assembly, which would be much more favorable to Nicolás Maduro as a result of the indirect electoral process that favors groups loyal to Chavismo that Nicolás Maduro has set in place.
Hard to imagine, be it a plebiscite or elections for a Constituent Assembly, taking place in the current context.
That's absolutely true. And one of the things that is abundantly clear is that given its very low popularity levels and the results of its really mismanaged economic and domestic policies, Maduro's government cannot, under any circumstances that are even remotely fair, win an election under current conditions. And we've seen that both in their electoral loss at the end of 2015 in the National Assembly, and also with the suspension of the gubernatorial elections since last year when they were slated to be held. The government fears elections right now, which is unfortunate because it would be the easiest pathway to having a transition. And right now, those pathways for transition are becoming decidedly grimmer and decidedly more violent. And that's something that has a lot of people, including myself, deeply concerned.
So you mentioned earlier Luisa Ortega, the Attorney General. We had that stunning scene earlier in the week where she refuses to honor a Supreme Court summons and instead stages a press conference. She is a Chavista denouncing President Maduro. Where is that going?
I would be surprised if she remains in power beyond the next couple of weeks. It's been an interesting story, the sort of dissolution of ties between Attorney General Ortega Diaz and the Venezuelan government. She was very much one of the faithful for a very long time. Her husband, Congressman Ferrer, he was particularly close to Chavez during the tail end of his illness in 2013. And that led to Maduro's transition. So this is really a very sort of marquee couple within Chavismo who have now turned. And what's been interesting about that process is that Luis Ortega was vacillating for a very long time in a very public manner on Maduro, which is something that historically Chavismo has not allowed for. Usually when people start to waver, they're purged. Which means that the illusion that Chavismo is very united and monolithic can be buttressed by the fact that when people denounce, it's after they leave, not when they're involved. And I think a mix of her high status and the respect she had within Chavismo, as well as the sort of high the high level of information that her husband most likely was privy to during the very secretive period of Chavez's final illness probably offered her considerable protection up until quite recently, which is one of the reasons the government, while moving decisively over the last week or so, was very slow to really institute a taking away of her office, which obviously has very strong constitutional ramifications and is deeply unconstitutional.
Just very briefly, because we're out of time, Daniel, the Reuters news agency reporting that at least 123 members of Venezuela's armed forces have been detained since those anti-government protests began in April. Is that number low or high in your esteem?
I think that number is probably about right. The defections of the military so far have not been organized coups so much as people refusing to continue their roles within a government they no longer believe in. As I think we've discussed before on the program, there are a lot of coordination issues having to do with the destruction of the chain of command over the last 15 years, having to do with the implications in various graft schemes, narco traffic, smuggling that many people in the armed forces have personal stakes in, that makes it difficult for the armed forces to really stage an intervention. That does not mean, however, that the soldiers themselves and lower officers themselves won't just get sick of things and end up defecting and often being arrested or fleeing the country.
All right, that moment is yet to happen, though.
That won't protect Maduro. But won't save Maduro, but which won't move decisively to remove him.
Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, many thanks for joining us from Chicago.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.